A biologist named Ian Bartoshik stands on a farm road east of Naples, Florida, holding a radio antenna. He doesn't look like a man about to make a discovery. He looks like a man checking his phone for a weak signal. Then a soft beeping starts, steady and rhythmic, and his expression changes. Somewhere out in the sawgrass and cypress, a 15-foot female Burmese python is coiled around a clutch of eggs, and the male python that led him there, a snake his own team surgically implanted with a transmitter months earlier, is lying right beside her. That male python isn't an enemy in this story, he's a spy. His name, if you could call it that, is a number and a nickname, Snakwan Vladi. One of roughly 40 males the Conservancy of Southwest Florida keeps tagged and tracked at any given time. He was caught, given a small radio implant, and released back into the wild for one purpose: to walk straight toward a mate during breeding season and betray her location to the humans, hunting his own species. It sounds almost too strange to be a real wildlife management strategy. It is real, and as of this year, it has helped remove more invasive snake biomass from the Florida wilderness in a single season than anyone thought possible when this fight began. To understand why Florida had to get this creative, you have to go back to how the fight started, and how badly it was losing for the first 2 decades. This is the story of the largest, strangest, most technologically inventive attempt to remove an invasive predator from an American ecosystem, and why the results this year finally started to look like they might actually be working. Burmese pythons are native to Southeast Asia, where they live in swamps, grasslands, and forest edges from India to Vietnam. Tihei are not small animals. A mature female can stretch past 16 feet and weigh well over 100 pounds. And in captivity, individuals have grown even larger. For decades, they were also popular in the American exotic pet trade, prized by reptile keepers for their size and their striking patterned skin. Somewhere along the way, through escapes, through accidental releases, and through owners who underestimated what a hatchling the length of a pencil would eventually become, pythons began turning up loose in the wetlands of South Florida. For years, one particular story circulated to explain the sudden appearance of so many snakes at once: that Hurricane Andrew, the catastrophic 1992 storm that leveled much of South Miami-Dade County, destroyed a python breeding facility, and released its captive stock directly into the wild. It's a tidy explanation, and it isn't entirely wrong. Some pythons likely did escape during that storm, but researchers who later reconstructed the timeline found a messier, less dramatic truth underneath it. Genetic and demographic evidence points to repeated releases and escapes across many years, from many separate sources, rather than a single catastrophic event. The population wasn't founded by one storm. IT was founded, gradually and almost invisibly, by the accumulated weight of an entire regional pet trade leaking into a landscape perfectly built to receive it. Officials first documented pythons living wild in the Everglades region in the 1980s. For a while, these sightings looked like isolated curiosities, a handful of escaped pets that would presumably die off in an unfamiliar climate. They didn't. By the year 2000, wildlife officials considered Burmese pythons an officially established breeding population inside Everglades National Park. And then the population did something South Florida's ecosystem had no real defense against. It exploded. The Everglades, it turned out, was close to perfect for them. Warm year-round temperatures, dense wetland cover that made the snakes almost impossible to spot, abundant prey with no evolved instinct to recognize a python as a threat, and critically, an almost complete absence of natural predators large enough to challenge a fully grown adult. A female python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a single clutch. Do that math across even a modest surviving population, spread across a landscape the size of the Everglades, and you get exponential growth with almost nothing standing in its way. The consequences showed up first not as python sightings, but as an eerie kind of silence. In 2012, a team of researchers led by a biologist at Davidson College published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that quantified something field biologists had already started to suspect from experience. The mammals of Everglades National Park were vanishing. The team compared nocturnal road survey data from the 1990s before. Python numbers surged against equivalent surveys conducted from 2003 through 2011, driving tens of thousands of miles along park roadways to record every animal sighted. Raccoon sightings had dropped by 99.3%. Opossum sightings had dropped by 98.9%. Bobcat sightings had fallen 87.5%. And white-tailed deer sightings by more than 94%. Rabbits and foxes, animals that had been common enough to appear regularly in roadkill counts a decade earlier, simply stopped appearing in the data at all. The declines were sharpest in the parts of the park where pythons had been established longest and weakest, in areas the snakes hadn't reached yet, a pattern that pointed directly at the predator, rather than at some unrelated environmental shift. The lead researcher, reflecting on the scale of what his team had found, noted that the sheer size of the decline hinted at just how dense the python population inside the park had already become by the time anyone thought to measure it. That single study reframed the python problem for the entire scientific community. This wasn't a curiosity about an odd, invasive reptile turning up in backyards. This was a functioning apex predator, introduced into an ecosystem with no evolutionary history of anything like it, quietly eating its way through the base of the food web. And the harder problem, the one that would define the next decade of Florida wildlife. Policy was this: how do you find and remove an animal that is specifically evolutionarily built to not be found? Burmese pythons are ambush predators with camouflage patterning that blends almost seamlessly into leaf litter and marsh grass. They can remain motionless for hours. They favor the densest, most difficult terrain in South Florida: flooded prairie, mangrove tangles, solution holes hidden under thick vegetation. Precisely the habitat human searchers struggle to move through at all. Early removal efforts relied on what amounted to organized luck: contracted hunters and volunteers walking levees and roadways at night with flashlights, hoping to spot a python crossing open ground. It worked, to a degree. From 2017 through 2024, once the state's formal removal programs were fully underway, hunters were pulling somewhere between 1,600 and 3,000 pythons out of South Florida every year. But researchers estimated the total wild population in the tens of thousands, possibly more, and there was no way road walking alone was ever going to keep pace with a species that could produce 100 eggs per female per year. So Florida's wildlife agencies and their research partners started building something closer to a full-scale intelligence operation against a single invasive species. The most important innovation came out of the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, which began a radio telemetry python program in 2013. The idea, on paper, is almost absurdly simple. If you can't reliably find pythons using your own senses, recruit the pythons to find each other. Researchers capture adult male pythons, surgically implant a small radio transmitter, and release them back into the exact spot they were caught. During breeding season, which runs roughly from January through April and peaks in mid-February, these males do what male pythons have always done. They follow pheromone trails left by reproductively active females, sometimes traveling remarkable distances to find a mate. Because the male carries a transmitter, biologists can track his movements in real time, and when he finally locates a female, he leads the research team directly to her. Researchers call these tagged males scout snakes. It's an accurate name, if a strange one to say out loud. Each scout is functionally a walking sensor, tuned by millions of years of evolution to detect the exact thing the humans are trying to eliminate, and willing to do it for free, over and over, breeding season after breeding season, because his own biology gives him no other choice. The math behind why this method works so much better than searching alone comes down to scale. A single human search team, no matter how skilled, can only cover so much ground on foot through flooded prairie and mangrove tangle in a given night. A scout snake, driven by instinct rather than fatigue, can cross open water, push through dense brush, and travel remarkable distances over the course of days or weeks, homing in on pheromone trails no human tracker could ever detect. The Conservancy's team has documented scout snakes traveling for miles before locating a breeding female, covering terrain that would take a search crew days to walk and search by hand. Multiply that reach across 40 tagged males working simultaneously through an entire breeding season, and a research team that could never hope to physically search a 200 square mile area on foot gains something close to full coverage, not because the humans got faster, but because they recruited a partner that was already faster than they could ever be. The payoff of finding a breeding female isn't just removing one large snake, it's removing every egg she was about to lay. Since the Conservancy's program began in 2013, its scout snake network has helped stop more than 20,000 python eggs from ever hatching, each one representing a potential future adult that would otherwise have gone on to prey on the Everglades' remaining mammal and bird populations for years. The program expanded in scope over time, with the U.S. Geological Survey, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service eventually partnering with the Conservancy to extend radio telemetry. Tracking into Big Cypress National Preserve and other areas of southwest Florida, the original program couldn't reach alone. For years, the numbers crept upward steadily rather than dramatically. Then, starting in 2025, something shifted, and the removal totals stopped looking like a gradual improvement and started looking like a genuine breakthrough. Part of the shift came from money and political will finally catching up to the science. In 2025, Florida invested $2 million into an expanded version of its Python Action Team program, known as Patrick, and partnered with a Miami-based company to increase the efficiency of contracted removal work, improving hunter pay, streamlining the logistics of the program, and setting an explicit goal of tripling annual python removals within 2 years. The results arrived far faster than the state's own timeline predicted. Comparing the same 3-month stretch, May through July, Removals jumped from 343 pythons in 2024 to 1,022 pythons in 2025, nearly triple in a single year, with July 2025 alone producing more pythons than the entirety of the previous year combined. By the end of August 2025, hunters had already removed more than 2,700 pythons for the year, matching the entire annual total from 2024, with 4 months still left on the calendar. The Conservancy's Scout Snake program, running in parallel, posted its own record numbers that same season. Between November 2025 and April 2026, one full breeding season, the Conservancy's team removed 177 pythons, weighing a combined 8,008 pounds from its roughly 200 square mile study area in Collier County, its largest single-season haul, by weight since the program began. That total included more than 4,100 python eggs pulled from the ecosystem before they could hatch. The average female captured that season weighed 95 pounds and carried around 70 eggs. The largest was a 17-foot, 153-pound animal that, when examined, was found to have recently eaten a white-tailed deer, one of roughly a quarter of the season's females carrying deer remains, a grim but useful data point confirming exactly what these animals are doing to the Everglades' remaining large mammal populations. And then there's the public-facing side of the fight, which turned an invasive species crisis into something resembling a folk sporting event. Since 2013, Florida has run an annual competition called the Florida Python Challenge, inviting members of the public to head into the Everglades and remove as many pythons as they can find over a 10-day window, competing for cash prizes funded by the state. It sounds almost like a gimmick, and in some ways it is, but it works as both a removal tool and a recruitment pipeline for a public that would otherwise have no way to participate in wildlife management at all. In 2025, 934 participants collectively removed a record 294 pythons. The grand prize winner alone caught 60. In 2026, that record didn't just get broken, it got shattered. 907 participants from 30 states, plus competitors from Canada and Vietnam, removed 280 pythons over 10 days, and the individual winner, a hunter named Tom Rahill, personally caught 96 snakes, nearly 40% more than the previous year's winning total. Add it all up across every method and every program, and the scale of the effort becomes almost hard to picture as a single campaign. By 2025, Florida wildlife officials estimated that more than 23,000 wild Burmese pythons had been removed from the state since record-keeping began in the year 2000. The Conservancy's telemetry team alone has pulled more than 53,000 pounds of python and over 25,000 eggs out of its southwests. Florida study zone since 2013. Multiple independent lines of effort, professional contracted hunters, federal and state radio, telemetry research teams, and thousands of ordinary members of the public during the annual challenge are now converging on the same population from different directions simultaneously, something the fight against this species has never had before. The removal effort has also started attracting an economic dimension that didn't exist in the early years of the program, when captured pythons were simply euthanized and discarded. State wildlife officials have partnered with private companies exploring uses for python skin and other byproducts, treating the invasive removal pipeline as a potential source of sustainable leather material, than pure waste. It's a small piece of the overall strategy, but it points at something important about how the state is thinking about this fight now, not as an emergency response that ends once the crisis passes, but as an ongoing permanent management operation that needs its own economics to stay funded for decades, because the python isn't going anywhere on its own. None of this means the python has been defeated. Researchers are careful, consistently, not to describe any of these numbers as victory. Burmese pythons are established and breeding across a landscape too vast and too dense to ever fully search by hand, and biologists widely agree that complete eradication from the Everglades is no longer a realistic goal. The population is simply too large, too well hidden, and too well adapted to the terrain. What these programs are actually built to do is something more modest, and in a strange way, more sustainable: suppress reproduction fast enough and consistently enough that the population's growth curve finally starts to bend rather than climb. The terrain itself remains the single hardest obstacle these programs have to overcome, and it's worth being specific about why. Much of the python's range inside the Everglades and Big Cypress is a mix of standing water, dense sawgrass prairie, and limestone solution holes. Natural pits and crevices in the bedrock that pythons use as shelter, and that are nearly impossible for a human searcher to check without specialized equipment. Researchers have experimented with a range of tools to get around this problem beyond the scout snake method. Detection dogs trained to identify python scent, environmental DNA sampling that can detect trace genetic material a python left behind in water it passed through, and pheromone-baited traps designed to lure males toward a scent signature without needing another live snake to do the work. Some of these approaches have shown promise in limited trials. Others, like large-scale trapping, have so far struggled to outperform simpler methods. None of them alone has matched what radiotelemetry and public removal events have accomplished. Together, which is part of why Florida's current approach relies on running every method at once rather than betting the whole effort on a single breakthrough technology. There are early signs that this bending has begun, and they're coming from an unexpected source: the scout snakes themselves. Conservancy biologists have noted that after more than a decade of radio telemetry tracking, their tagged males are increasingly struggling to locate mates during breeding season, and when they do find a female, she is more often smaller than the giants. Researchers were pulling out of the marsh a few years earlier. Neither observation proves the population is shrinking in any precise, countable sense. Wild python numbers are notoriously difficult to estimate directly, since the animals are so effective at hiding. But a scout snake's job is to follow scent trails toward reproductive females as efficiently as millions of years of evolution allow him to. If those trails are getting fainter, harder to find, and leading to smaller animals, that's exactly the kind of indirect signal biologists watch for when a top predator is finally starting to run out of easy targets. What makes this story worth telling isn't just the raw removal totals, impressive as they've become, it's the shape of the strategy itself. A slow 20-year pivot from brute force searching towards something closer to turning the invader's own biology into the weapon used against it. Nobody designed a better flashlight to solve this problem. Nobody found a poison that works only on pythons. The breakthrough came from watching how the snake actually behaves, understanding precisely what drives it during the handful of weeks each year when it's most vulnerable, and building an entire removal infrastructure around that narrow window. The scout snake doesn't fight the invasion. He simply keeps doing what a wild python has always done, and in doing so, quietly hands his own kind over to the people trying to slow them down. There's something almost uncomfortable about how effective that idea turned out to be. Using an animal's own drive to reproduce as the mechanism for stopping its reproduction. It's not a clean, heroic image, the way capturing a python by hand in a flashlight beam might be. It's colder and more clinical than that. Patient biologists implanting transmitters, tracking beeping signals across a swamp for months at a time, waiting for instinct to do the work that human search in G never could. But cold and clinical is exactly what a fight against an animal this well hidden seems to require. The Everglades isn't going to be searched into safety. It's going to be outthought, one breeding season and one betrayed mate at a time. For 20 years, the story of the Burmese python in Florida was a story about how badly an ecosystem can lose when an apex predator arrives with no natural checks in place. A story written in vanishing raccoons, disappearing rabbits, and roadkill surveys that stopped finding what they used to find. The last 2 years are the first real evidence that the story might finally be turning, not because the python problem is solved, but because the people fighting it stopped trying to outsearch an animal built for hiding and started using the snake's own instincts against it instead. If a program built on radio-tagged spies and a 10-day public hunting contest can move the needle this much against an invader, this deeply entrenched, the real question left standing is, what happens to the next invasive species that arrives in an American wetland with no one watching, and whether anyone will be ready to think this strangely, this fast, the next time it matters.